Hello and welcome back. We are talking all about pattern testing again today, but this time we're talking about it from a designer's perspective. We're going to talk about everything from what to include in your applications to what to include in your note form. We'll talk about compensation, and of course, we'll talk about the differences between pattern testing and tech editing. So let's hop in. Tech editing, testing, what are the differences? What should we be doing? Tech editing is when a professional tech editor looks over your pattern for you. They thoroughly check your math, your grading, your grammar, and any inconsistencies in formatting. This is really valuable if you're prone to typos like me, or if you're newer to designing and a little bit insecure with your grading process. Tech editors are not responsible for making a sample from your pattern though. And that's why pattern testing is still important. So while tech editors might be great at editing and checking all of your math, they're not necessarily going to know for absolute sure if that garment is going to fit all of the sizes the way that you're intending it to. The only way to check for that is in testing. So I think in an ideal world, we would be doing both tech editing and testing of all of our patterns, especially if they're garments. Like I said last week, pattern testing is where you give a rough draft of your pattern to a group of people, hopefully representing a large number of the sizes that your pattern is graded for, and they make a sample from that rough draft of the pattern. It's the only surefire way as a designer to ensure that your crochet wearable designs are going to fit your customers and makers the way that you intend them to. So let's dive into how to run an effective pattern test from a designer's perspective. Before you even do a testing call, you should have a final sample made. This means you should never be doing a tester call based on a swatch, based on a sketch, or an incomplete piece. In my humble opinion, this also means that if you're doing a secret test call, testers should be able to see that piece before they even apply to test. But how do you have a secret design and not show it to testers? It gets a little bit tricky. Personally, this is why I use a closed tester call list. I have an email list of a few hundred people that I send all of my tester calls to first. If it's a secret test, I tell them, do not share anything contained in this email. This is a secret test. So that's one way you can kind of get around it needing to be a secret. So let's talk about the difference between open testing calls and closed testing calls. Open testing calls are what you see the most on social media. This is where a designer will just call for testers on their grid on Instagram, on their Facebook page, in their stories. Somewhere they're saying, I need testers for this item, apply via the link in my bio. For me, I find these kind of testing calls a little overwhelming because sometimes you'll get hundreds of applications just for one piece that you only need 18 to 25 testers for. And that's why I manage a closed tester email list. When I have something that's ready to be tested, I email that group of testers first and allow them first dibs at applications. If I get all of the sizes covered doing that, that's it. That never goes public. If I don't get all of the sizes covered, then I do have to open up the test a little bit at least. Typically what I'll do then is I'll post it in my Instagram broadcast channel or on my Instagram stories for the specific sizes that I need coverage for. Usually the only secrets that I have in testing are secret colors. These colors are usually indie dyers that I'm working with that have colors launching several months out. In this case, if I have to open up a public call for certain sizes, I will just put it in grayscale. Because I think it's super important for testers to be able to see what the finished product looks like before they sign up for testing. So what information should we be providing potential testers before they even apply? A photo of the finished object, the weight of yarn and how much yarn you guesstimate will be required for each size, the timeline of the test, and any other expectations you have for your testers, like photos. What should we be including in a tester application form? Obviously, name, email address. I also like to peek at people's Instagram profiles, so I ask for that link as well in my forms. You can also ask for anything that's important to you as a designer to know about your testers. Another obvious one is size. I ask for sizes in inches. Most of my things are sweaters and tops, so I always ask for a bust measurement in those applications. I ask for an actual measurement instead of just which size are you going to test to ensure that I'm assigning the sizes to the testers. And then also some kind of agreement that they're going to finish by the deadline. How do we determine testing timelines? I'm going to give you the formula that I use. We want to make sure that we're giving enough time for all of the sizes to complete on time. So here's my rule. I take the number of meters of yarn that the largest size will need and divide it by about 400 to 450 meters per week. Then I add an extra week that is kind of like the buffer days before and after a test, where you're gathering materials, where you're blocking the garment, taking photos, compiling your notes. So, for example, you have a project where the 5X is going to use 2,000 meters of yarn. We divide that by 400 and get 5. But we're not giving 5 weeks for testing. We're going to add one more. We're giving 6 weeks for testing. Now, I will also add extra weeks for every degree of difficulty in the pattern as well. So let's say your pattern has lace work or color work or a lot of shaping and counting. We need to add an additional week for each of those items. And if you're ever in doubt or you get like 5.5 weeks, just round up. Okay, so you've determined the timelines, you've sent out the tester application. How do you choose the testers? For me, I love a good mix of testers. I want some testers who are expert testers, who have tested for me 10 times before and will test for me 10 times more. And testers who have never tested for me before. The testers who have tested for me 10 times before are so used to how my patterns are written that sometimes they'll miss things that are a little bit gray. But those new to me testers are going to be like, hang on, that doesn't make sense. The same thing is true of my customers. I have some customers who have bought dozens of patterns for me and some who have yet to buy any patterns from me. I want to make sure that each of those groups is going to understand my patterns. And the best way to do that is to have my pattern testing group represent those two groups. The same thing goes for crochet skills as well. I want some expert crocheters in there, and I want some more novice crocheters that are going to have more questions come up. That being said, a lot of my designs are not super absolute beginner friendly, so I might not bring on a tester who's only ever made a dishcloth before for a fingering weight sweater that has short rows in it. Basically, you want your tester group to be as representative of your customer group as possible, because different people are going to see different things and question different things. The next thing I look for are photos. For me, photos are such a crucial part of a test for me to see how my pieces fit bodies that are different than mine. So I want to see that you're comfortable getting in front of the camera and taking photos of your finished objects. The easiest way for me to do that is through your public Instagram profile. If you don't have a public Instagram profile, it doesn't automatically exclude you from testing. It just makes it a little bit more challenging, as I'll have to ask you to submit photos to me to show that you can take finished object photos. While I do love to receive fancy finished object photos from testers, they don't necessarily need to be all dolled up and fancy. They can just be very basic. I want to be able to see how the piece fits your body. That's the primary concern with photos. Secondarily, I want to be able to show my customers how my piece looks on a body that's similar to theirs, so I love to be able to showcase tester photos as much as possible. And that's why a lot of designers, like myself, heavily favor people who have those public Instagram accounts and who aren't afraid of getting on the camera. We don't want to make anyone uncomfortable in the testing process sharing photos of them that they're not comfortable with. Okay, next, what do we send to the chosen testers? Obviously, the full rough draft of the pattern is important to send, and we want to give them as much information as possible to set them up for success. For example, expectations that we have of them during the test. How do we want them to communicate questions to us? Where do we want them to submit their notes and photos? What type of notes and photos do we want from them? What do they need to do if they find a mistake in the pattern? And we also want to let them know how long they can expect to wait to hear back from us if an issue comes up. I also love to include a rough timeline of the test as well too. So I write this out for the testers, like week 1, you should be gathering materials. Week 2 and 3, you should be working on the yoke of the sweater. Week 4 and 5, you should be working on the body. This helps testers to keep themselves on track. This also makes it easier on me for when I'm checking in with my testers to see where they're at. I can go to the timeline that I created and say, okay, they should be finishing their body by Friday. I go and check in on them on Friday, and 2 of them are still on the yoke and 3 of them are on the sleeves. We have some testers who have fallen behind. I'm going to take time, communicate with them, trying to catch them back up. Let's talk about my non-negotiables in testing. I've got 3. 1, not surprising. Gauge. You have to achieve gauge in testing. Gauge is going to dictate how the piece fits you, and it's going to dictate how much yarn you use to make the piece. And honestly, those are 2 of the biggest, most important things in testing for me. 2, sizes. I always get testers to test the size that the pattern says they should be testing based on, let's say, their bust measurement for a sweater. Let's say it's a sweater with 6 inches of positive ease and a tester's like, I don't want that much ease. Can I do a size smaller? For testing, I unfortunately do not allow this because, again, I really want to show how the pattern as it's designed looks on as many bodies as possible. And I think it is a responsibility of designers to be assigning sizes to testers. Some designers might be okay with shifting between sizes for a little more or a little less ease. That's a judgment call on those designers' parts. I personally wouldn't allow it. 3, modifications. I mentioned this in last week's video too. This is a hard no for me. If we're allowing testers to make modifications to the pattern, it's not showcasing the design as it's intended. So no adding of stitches, no subtracting of stitches, no adding of rows, subtracting of rows. I personally am not even comfortable allowing striping or color blocking unless that's actually in the pattern, because then my customers might assume that there's instructions on striping or color blocking in the pattern. There is one exception to this rule that needs to be followed every time. If the pattern, as it's written, is not fitting someone's body, it needs to be modified to fit their body. 2 ways this might happen. 1, it might actually be the designer's mistake. Maybe they messed up their math somehow. That needs to be fixed. And 2, all of our bodies are wildly different. When we grade our designs, we're doing it based on average sizes. No one is a perfect average size. For example, if you have a tester whose bicep is, say, 2 inches more than their corresponding bust measurement says it should be, then it's time to make a little modification to make sure that those sleeves fit their arms properly. Throughout the testing period, designers need to be readily available to answer pattern tester questions. For me personally, I do this through an Instagram group chat. It's one of the last things I do before bed at night, and one of the first things I do every morning is check in my tester group chats to see if there's any questions. We want to be getting answers back to those testers as quickly and efficiently as possible as well too, and making any fixes or edits very promptly. If you have anything going on in your life that might prevent you from getting back to testers in a timely fashion, like a full-time job, kids, family obligations, whatever it is, that's totally fine. But you might just need to add a bit of extra time to your testing phases to account for those lags in testers getting answers from you. Because if a tester has paused and is waiting for an answer from you every day that they're paused, every hour that they're paused, that is eating into the testing timeline. Okay, here's another hot topic: compensation. How should we be rewarding our testers for giving us so much of their time and skills? The industry standard right now is obviously the final fully edited PDF. Sharing of any of their photos, or as many of their photos as you possibly can. Sorry to my own testers on this. This is definitely a thing I struggle with, making sure that I share all of your photos. And typically designers will also include a coupon code for another free pattern from their library for their testers. Often too, a lot of yarn companies and even indie dyers that designers work with will give testers a discount on the yarn if they want to use the same yarn that the designer did in their design. Financial compensation. Personally, I would love to be able to financially compensate my testers for all of the time and value that they bring to my business, but I just don't make enough in my designing business in order to adequately pay for testing. Let's say, for example, I want to pay testers $20 an hour to create a sweater that takes 60 hours to make. That's $1,200 per tester. If I have 2 testers per size, that's 18 testers per design, which works out to $21,600 per design. I'm personally not even close to making that amount per new design. I do roughly 12 new garment patterns per year, so that would work out to $259,200 per year in pattern testing costs. and that is far above what I am making every year, let alone the yarn cost if I were providing yarn support as well. So for right now, unfortunately, I know I personally can't afford to financially compensate testers as much as I would love to. What should we be asking from our testers in their final notes? Obviously, again, name, email, the size they completed, how much yarn they used and what yarn specifically they used, what hook size they used. I also always ask what their final gauge is on their final piece. You'd be surprised at how many testers admit to having incorrect gauge. If someone's gauge is incorrect and the piece isn't fitting them right, or the amount of yarn they use is kind of outlying, that might be why. We also want to ask testers about any errors that are still in the pattern, and anything else that you as a designer think is important, or anything else that the testers think are important. I kind of have like a catch-all question at the end. Then obviously photos. Tools that I use during testing are Google Forms for both the application and the tester notes. I love this because there's a little Sheets button at the top, and it'll take all of the submissions from your form and put them into a Google Sheet, so you can sort everything by size, by person. It's just great for organization. Google Forms will also create a folder for all of the photos that are submitted. I upload the pattern and any other pertinent information to a Google Drive folder, and that's where testers go to access the resources for the test. I really use a whole lot of Google products in testing. Then, as I mentioned before, I also use Instagram for the group chats for the test. Everything else is via email. I know some designers will use Google Docs as like a working document for their patterns. Personally, I don't love everybody being able to edit and comment, so I don't use that option. I also know some other designers who use Canva in a similar way, and there's so many different platforms that we can have our tester group chats on. Facebook groups, Facebook Messenger, Discord, you name it, it exists. Okay, now for a couple of your questions from Instagram that I haven't gotten to yet. The first is, how many testers do I take per size? Ideally 2. If I only get one application and it's somebody who's very seasoned with testing for me, I'll allow it. That being said, if I get 2 applications and neither of them have tested for me before, I'll probably put 3 in for that size, just to make sure that I'm well covered. That leads to, what do I do if I can't find a tester for a certain size? So if I haven't found a tester for a certain size in my closed email list, then I'll post an open call on Instagram. Usually I can get most of the sizes covered through that. If there's still a size or 2 that I don't have any applications for, I will still proceed with the test. For those sizes, I then need to go over them with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that all of my numbers are correct. Or I can get it tech edited and have a tech editor do that fine-tooth combing for me. Additionally, I've seen other designers who will actually put which sizes were not tested right in the listing for their pattern for sale. And if you want to test those specific sizes, you can email the designer and say, hey, I'm this size bust and I saw that it wasn't tested. Can I test it for you? And then that tester and designer can work together to set up like a mini test just for them. And that's it. That is all the things that I can think of to share with you about pattern testing from a designer's perspective, and answers to all of the questions I received on Instagram. Thanks so much for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Do all the YouTube things, and we'll see you again soon.